participantes, vemos ahí que van sumándose. Quiero daros la bienvenida a esta nueva sesión de nuestro programa Defensa y Yo. Como sabéis, hoy queremos analizar, revisar, discutir sobre cómo el cambio climático se está convirtiendo en una creciente amenaza para la seguridad global. Como sabéis también, este programa es parte de una colaboración que es global, tiene con la Embajada de Estados Unidos para abordar temas de seguridad y de defensa que a veces quedan un poco fuera del radar, lamentablemente no en los últimos tiempos, pero hasta hace no mucho siempre quedaban fuera del radar de la opinión pública en general y de...
And this is very foremost now in the minds of university students and public in general. And we have a great number of university students listening. Today we have
Michael Clare, a Montse Abad, a Noriol Costa, los presentaré después. Contamos con la colaboración de la Universidad Carlos III de Madrid y con la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona. Muchas gracias por ello y gracias también a todos los que os habéis conectado y os estáis conectando. Un par de avisos, consejos, advertencias. La sesión va a ser sobre todo en inglés, pero es en inglés y en español indistintamente y podéis acceder al otro idioma a través del botón de interpretación que tenéis todos en vuestras pantallas. Y después la parte más interesante de estas sesiones es normalmente aquella en la que recogemos vuestras preguntas y comentarios. Así que os invito desde ya a ir haciendo preguntas a través del chat cuando nuestros expertos hayan hecho con nosotros una primera aproximación al tema, después os iré dando paso ya a la palabra. Y creo que sin más, lo primero que quiero hacer es darle la palabra a Álvaro de Argüelles, que fue el ganador del concurso del año pasado. Como sabéis también hay una parte de este programa que es un concurso entre vosotros, entre los estudiantes, para que compartáis con el resto reflexiones sobre cuáles son estas amenazas para la seguridad, cuál es el futuro de la OTAN y cómo enfocáis o cómo creéis que se debería enfocar el nuevo concepto estratégico que se presentará en la cumbre de Madrid y por lo tanto os invito a que vayáis pensando ya también cuáles van a ser vuestras propuestas. Como digo, Álvaro fue el ganador por parte de la Universidad Carlos III el año pasado y quería darle la palabra para que comparta con vosotros algunas impresiones. Álvaro, por favor.
Claro, hola, buenas tardes. Pues yo participé en el concurso el año pasado, era alumno de doble grado de Estudios Internacionales y Derecho en la Carlos III, ya me he graduado y bueno, pues os animo a participar en el concurso porque realmente es una experiencia única, increíble, que evidentemente la oportunidad de viajar al cuartel general de la OTAN pues no la tiene cualquiera, huelga decirlo, pero que va mucho más allá de eso. Yo desde entonces, que viajé en noviembre del año pasado, pero he participado en un montón de charlas, un montón de eventos, entonces creo que merece totalmente la pena, de verdad. Yo en su día estaba apurado pensando si escribir o no el paper, si participar. Desde luego me animé y no podía estar más contento con mi decisión. Y bueno, pues si os parece ahora en el chat voy a poner mi dirección de correo por si alguno tuviera alguna pregunta a la hora de escribir el paper o si os pudiera ayudar de alguna forma, pues si queréis lo pongo por ahí, ¿de acuerdo? Así que nada, encantado.
Pues muchísimas gracias, Álvaro. Tú ganaste precisamente con un documento sobre estos temas, ¿verdad? ¿Cómo hiciste tu aproximación?
Bueno, el año pasado eran otros temas, o sea, son los mismos temas pero con distintas universidades y en concreto el año pasado la Carlos III fue sobre el papel de la mujer en la resolución de conflictos y yo lo quise orientar de una forma muy práctica, casi como con guiones, con propuestas concretas de cómo nosotros los jóvenes podíamos ayudar, pues dentro de nuestras capacidades evidentemente, a fomentar el papel de las mujeres en las misiones de paz. Concretamente yo me centré en el norte de África y un compañero mío de la Universidad de Santiago de Compostela fue el que hizo el tema de medio ambiente que cada año se van rotando.
Es cierto. Pues muchísimas gracias, Álvaro. Y ya vamos a empezar con nuestros expertos también. Primero le quiero dar la palabra a Michael Clare, que es profesor emérito de Estudios de Paz y Seguridad Mundial y es el director del programa de Estudios de Paz y Seguridad Global en el Fife College. Michael, please, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Good. All right. Well, I'm delighted to be here. I wish I were present with you all in Madrid. That would be very exciting. And I certainly appreciate the opportunity for dialogue with students from Spain. So let me jump into the topic. And I'm pleased to have been invited by the embassy to address this topic. The topic is climate change and security, addressing a growing global threat. This is a very provocative and important topic and could take us in many directions. And I look forward to what the other panelists have to say. What it prompted in me is to ask the question, what exactly do we mean by security in the title of the topic? Because security can have many meanings. Now, I've just completed a book about climate change and American national security. So national security is one component of security. My book is called All Hell Breaking Loose, the Pentagon's Perspective on Climate Change. And in it, I describe the evolution of US military thinking on the impact of climate change on US national security. As I say, one dimension of this topic. So I could say a lot about climate change and national security, and I'll say a bit more in a minute. But I recognize that there are other dimensions of security that pertain to this discussion, including human security and international security. So let me use my time, I won't be long, to say a few words about each of these dimensions of security: human security, national security, and international security. First, human security, as it fits into this equation. Human security, or the safety and well-being of individuals, communities, villages, families, tribes, and so on, is affected by climate change both directly and indirectly. Human communities, however we define them, suffer directly from climate change through severe storms, extreme flooding, wildfires, and other extreme effects of climate change. These are becoming more frequent and more dangerous and more extreme as global temperatures rise. And people are going to suffer as a consequence. In my country, just as in Spain, there have been severe wildfires, droughts, flooding, and many people have suffered as a result. Now, everybody is at risk from the effects of climate change at a human level. But those on the margins of society, women, minorities, the disabled, the elderly, often suffer disproportionately from the effects of climate change. And this is something we have to be aware of, either because they live in more exposed locations, in floodplains. Often the poor are forced to live in the most exposed floodplains or on hillsides that wash away in storms, or they're forced to work in jobs that expose them to the effects of climate change, like agriculture or outdoor labor. And when it's warming the way it is, they are going to be suffer from extreme heat conditions. So climate change affects humans at that human security level in many ways. Humans also suffer indirectly from the effects of climate change, from drought and desertification that is affecting global food security on a very large scale. It often forces people, whole communities, whole peoples to abandon their traditional farmlands and to migrate to other lands, to other cities, to the cities, to other countries. And this often results in conflict, friction and conflict, and sometimes violence. And as the global temperatures rise, we can expect more of these migratory flows. And this certainly is going to be one of the most important consequences of climate change in the years ahead that we're going to have to address. So that's the case of human security. Of course, we could say more about that. Briefly on the issue of national security, the topic that I studied. And I will speak of American national security, but the same is true of other countries and NATO. But speaking of the US and the NATO countries, I would say, if you ask senior officers what is the greatest threat to the US national security, they will say China, then Russia. Or now maybe they'll say Russia, then China. There's a discussion about that right now. But they'll say Russia and China is the greatest threat. But if you sit down with them and have a conversation, probe more deeply, they'll say, well, yes, but in time, climate change will increasingly pose a threat to our national security. And in fact, under President Biden and our new Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, climate change has been identified as a threat to national security and a priority for the military to adapt. So why is climate change viewed as such a serious threat? For a number of reasons. I could speak at length, but very briefly, one concern of the military is that climate change will unleash chaos and conflict around the world, often in parts of the world that have strategic importance to the United States, countries that are allies or that possess nuclear weapons or that play an important role in the world's economy are viewed as being very vulnerable to the effects of climate change and to the possibility of state collapse. Think of Nigeria or Pakistan or Indonesia or the Philippines. These are countries that matter very significantly to US national security. And there's a great concern that they are at risk of disintegration or internal warfare, state collapse as climate change advances, and that this will require intervention by the US military in one form or another, therefore diverting troops and resources away from the primary job of defending against China and Russia. So it's viewed as a diversion, a diversion of resources. That's one fear. Another fear is that climate change will undermine and weaken, undermine the utility of US military bases around the world. It turns out that US military bases, especially naval and air facilities, are at great risk from the effects of climate change. US naval bases on the Atlantic coast are very exposed to sea level rise and extreme storms. And those in the Pacific, many of them are on low-lying islands, are exposed to typhoons and sea level rise. And there is a great fear that these bases will not be available in the future if there's a conflict in Europe, say, or in the Pacific, where the US has to be able to support forces abroad, but their bases at home are inaccessible. So these are some of the ways in which climate change fits into national security. I could come back to that. But let me finish by saying a few words about international security, climate change and international security, because that's where the stakes are highest and where there's some hope and also despair about the possibility of cooperation. This is the most important area because the stakes are so high. Now, when I talk about international security, I mean the climate effects that threaten the international system as a whole, rather than individual countries or groups of countries. So, as a consequence of the war now underway in Ukraine, which we're all watching very closely, and the international sanctions that have been imposed by the Western countries, we have become exceptionally aware of how intertwined the world economic order has become. We've learned how highly interdependent the nations of the world have become, and how reliant we are on global networks of trade in food, in energy, in other essential commodities. We've discovered that while we desire to sever ties, economic ties, trade ties with Russia for reasons that are understandable, we find that many countries depend on Russia for vital supplies of oil, natural gas, wheat, other food products. And it's proving very difficult to do this. Climate change is going to act in very much the same way as war and sanctions, only far worse. Climate change will pose an even greater threat to the survival and stability of international trade networks and food supply networks. And we're seeing that already. For example, a confluence of many severe storms occurring simultaneously around the world can dismember global food and energy chains, so that the global supply of these essential commodities breaks down. This occurred in 2010 when extreme heat waves in Russia and Ukraine forced a breakdown in the global trade in food, combined with severe flooding in China and droughts in Australia, meant that the global food wheat supply and rice supply plunged, and food prices rose throughout North Africa and the Middle East. And this in many ways was the trigger for the Arab Spring. Well, right now we're experiencing very similar conditions, brought about in part because Russia is being cut off from the wheat trade. Ukraine, one of the world's leading providers of wheat, because of war, is unable to export its wheat. So there is a diminished supply because of war, but at the same time, there is extreme drought in East Africa, which is climate change related, and extreme flooding in China, which has destroyed their winter crop. So the global demand for wheat is again exactly the way it was in 2010. Food prices are rising throughout North Africa and the Middle East, and we're beginning to see the same kind of unrest as we saw in 2010. So we can see how international security, that whole world system, is going to be affected. Another way in which the larger world system is at risk is through the diminished water supply on shared river systems. The melting of the Himalayan glaciers, for example, is going to diminish dry season water supply on major rivers in Asia, like the Indus River, the Brahmaputra River, the Mekong River. And this could lead to strife between nuclear-armed countries, between India and China, between India and Pakistan. And as time goes on, these kinds of water-related but international conflicts could become more frequent. So So the international security dimensions of climate change loom ever more important in the future, I believe. Hence, negotiations between and consultation, negotiations between the nations of the world to address climate change and to slow the pace of warming become ever more critical. Yet, with the conflicts underway in the world, it's getting harder to reach, to have those consultations and negotiations. So from my perspective, it's essential that we recognize the severity of climate change as a security threat, so that nations come to see that adopting international measures like the Paris Climate Agreement and enforcing that is just as important to their survival as traditional notions of defending against traditional armed enemies. And I'll stop with that notion and look forward to what others have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for such a clear overview of the many angles that climate change has with security. And also thank you for bringing to the discussion the recent conflict with the war in Ukraine, and how that also interacts with other conflicts and other very worrisome situations caused by climate change. That reminds me that we thought, many thinkers, many authors, including myself, thought that interdependence in the global system would reduce the risk of conflict, because we were depending on the others. But clearly we were wrong with this. We were wrong with Russia completely, and all the dependence that the West has on Russia and the other way around hasn't been able to stop this awful war, which we are seeing every day. Let me now move to Montse Abad. Montse is Professor of International Law at the Universidad Carlos III de Madrid, and she's a member of the CEDIT of the Red Cross here in Spain. Montse, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christina. It is my privilege to be here with all of you today. So many thanks to you and the organizers. I have built my comments on a list of 4 main assumptions and some provisional conclusions at the end. The first assumption is that climate change is at least a threat multiplier, and there have been some milestones in the recognition of links between climate change and security risks since 2007, initially linked to the Sahel region. In addition to experts, the G7, the United Nations, and the European Union paved the way, showing how climate change can act as a threat multiplier of certain insecurities and vulnerabilities as poverty, inequality, or the lack of the rule of law. How? For instance, increasing local resource competition, for example, in Afghanistan, triggering livelihood insecurity and migration, for example, in Mali, disrupting food production in many regions, for example, in the Middle East, increasing the tensions on transboundary water management, for example, in the Nile Basin, or leading to significant sea level rise and coastal degradation, for example, in Bangladesh or Kiribati. The second assumption is that this present decade is crucial to address the existential threat posed by a triple planetary emergency, that is climate, loss of biodiversity, and pollution crisis. Science is clear in this regard. The following 10 years are crucial in order to achieve the Paris Agreement's goal of limiting global temperature increase to well below 2 degrees Celsius. Therefore, humankind needs to transform its relationship with nature, It is necessary to make peace with nature, as it is well explained in the United Nations Environmental Programme's report, with this same slogan, this motto, launched in 2021. From a security perspective, practical concerns are overlapping, as Michael said, for individuals, for states, for international society, and also for the planet Earth as such, from an ecological, ecocentric perspective. Some manifestations of these are a shift of climate zones and increasingly frequent and intense extreme weather hazards, as he said, floodings, droughts, the melting of the Arctic and the Antarctica, with more than geopolitical consequences. The magnitude of this threat is reflected in the growing use of the concept of Anthropocene, coined to describe a new era in planetary history when the social and economic activities of humankind, mostly from the global north, disrupting the Earth's life upholding systems in very deep and possibly irreversible ways. The Anthropocene calls for new ways of thinking of security. The third assumption is that the current existential threat to the world order that is posed by Putin's aggression and the invasion of Ukraine may jeopardize the fight against climate change. Because as a consequence of this war, states are drawing an immediate reshape of priorities from a conceptual and economic point of view, returning to a traditional vision of security connected with hard threats, in particular the military ones. And military spending is expected to grow to detriment of the protection of the environment, with continuing dependency on fossil fuels, which could even be aggravated. In addition, there is not yet a normative duty to take care of the environment at the universal level, and prospects for multilateralism and consensus are not optimistic at the moment. So the last, but not least, fourth assumption that looks forward is that future pathways for environmental protection should engage with a multiplicity of strategic elements and look for synergies. Security has many possible meanings, as Michael said, also has different angles and dimensions. Therefore, it is necessary to put in place transversal approaches and leverage possible connections beyond specific climate protection measures as such. Nature must be the main parameter. It is crucial to connect the dots between diverse elements, realities, and methodologies. In particular, I could mention specific linkages with biodiversity. Security is also here, of course, given the COVID-19 pandemic and the likelihood for further zoonotic diseases appearing. Also with conflicts and peace, with human rights, including the recent recognition of the right to a healthy, clean, and safe environment. Also the side of the rights of nature, and the implementation of the 2030 agenda, which gave a blueprint for action not only for states, but also for non-state actors, including civil society at large, and referring to a specific sustainable development goal referred to climate action, and also others to the conservation of nature. If we take one of these points, for instance, the linkages with conflicts and peace due to the Ukraine war, we could see as this is a multifaceted sphere that continues to be underexplored in all its possible temporal dimensions before armed conflicts, during armed conflicts, and after armed conflicts. Looking at the current war in Ukraine, the long-term ecological effects are still unknown. In any event, the use of certain weapons, cluster munitions, attacks on oil refineries, the devastation of the agriculture, the scorched earth policy, beyond the war crimes and the extremely dangerous explosive remnants of war, they will also leave a very toxic legacy, as these poisonous substances can seep into the soil and groundwater and enter food chain.
Entrar en la cadena alimenticia y plantear amenazas muy largas en el espacio y tiempo.
All these aspects should be taken into account among the indispensable elements in the framework of environmental peace building. In short, solutions such as renewable energies, reforestation, but also many other potential green approaches and initiatives are key to achieve at the same time safety, security, sustainability, justice, and peace in our green-blue planet. Finally, I have three initial conclusions. First, it is urgent to establish the pending universal duty to take care of nature. Second, it is essential to bring a shift to a holistic approach regarding nature conservation and security, and also further strategic and better investments. And third, rather than noting feelings of pessimism at this moment, I think that it is crucial to advocate for action, not only action from policymakers, diplomats, practitioners, NGOs, academic researchers, but also from civil society at large, because individual choices matter and everyone has a role to play, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Montse. You appeal to the urgency. In fact, many people say that we shouldn't be talking about climate change, but about a climate emergency. And I just also want to remind that yesterday the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, issued another assessment saying that either we rush and cut our emissions by half by 2025, which is the day after tomorrow, or as you were saying, this can be really irreversible. And now the question there is, with this unfolding crisis, with this conflict, which is also making us invest more on security, but maybe forgetting about climate. On the other hand, there is an opportunity there to stop the dependency on some countries and on some sources of energy. And I think Cory also wants to talk about that and about the role of certain states. As you know, Orioli is Associate Professor of International Relations, as I said, at Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona. He's also the coordinator of the grade in International Relations. Oriol, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
I used to be the coordinator of the undergraduate BA degree. I loved it being the coordinator, but then I moved on to other more bureaucratic stuff. I'm afraid, with less contact with the students. So I have. Thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be able to talk about this stuff with people coming from different institutions and different backgrounds and different academic cultures. So I really enjoy it. I've been trying to rework my comments around what has already been said, because lots of stuff has already been unpacked and in very nicely and organized and orderly fashion. So I've tried to rework it so as to accommodate for what has already been said and avoid overlaps. I've identified a few things that I think that have been left unsaid so far, and that I would like to perhaps emphasize. I have like 4 different ideas. The first one on inertia, an idea on maps, and then 2 ideas on governance. The first one on inertia is that I'm afraid that we have seen nothing yet. right? That the wars is yet to come and will be unfolding for a very long time, whatever we do on the climate change front. The impact, the link between climate change and violent conflict is mediated by a number of different social processes. We expect it to be mediated by a number of different social processes. First thing that will happen is that climate change erodes social institutions that provide for public goods. It reduces the legitimacy of authorities and their capacity to mediate conflicts. It triggers population movements into weakly governed spaces. It erodes social trust. It builds up into a social crisis before it becomes it becomes a violent conflict, right? And these processes are very hard to reverse. So even if we address climate change along the time scale outlined by the IPCC, which I think is very doubtful, to be honest, and I'm afraid it's very doubtful. I mean, I would like to be wrong on this front, of course, but even if we did so, we can expect the water to pile up before the dam, and at some point break it. In a number of different ways. There's a whole lot of inertia into the system. There's a whole lot of inertia in the climate system itself, and then in the ways in which changes in the climate change system might bring about violent conflict. So I'm afraid that my first idea is not a very optimistic one, but I think we should be aware of that. The second idea was about maps. And again, it might be a pessimistic one, which is that even if we think of energy transition as a way to deactivate perhaps some hotspots of geopolitical tension here and there, we are, I think, just shifting the map. But there was a nice piece in this last week, I think it was this last week, issue of The Economist on this. We will be moving from petrostates and petroregions that are rich in not only oil but also geopolitical competition and thus potentially leading to violent conflict as well. We will shift from that map to a map of electrostates in which we will be depending on a bunch of states that have the minerals that are needed for the production and storage of renewable energy, both solar and wind and of course batteries and so on. And this move will. So my point, I guess, here is that electrification and the move from fossil fuels to renewables, which we might see as an opportunity for leaving behind a map of geopolitical competition that has been with us for decades, if not a century now, will just bring it with it a new, different map that we should be ready to address. I think the good thing about this is that we can foresee what this map will look like, and that we can, I guess, the West can address the governance shortcomings and the institutional problems that these states might have in the process, and perhaps avoid the wars. But we will be moving towards a new map of at least a new map of some conflicts related with energy. And then finally, the two ideas on governance. The first one is, I think, the nightmare scenario, which is that as we move into a world in which there's increased pressure to manage droughts and sustain crop yields and avoid food shortages, the pressure for the use of technologies that have a capacity to locally mitigate climate change, geoengineering technologies that have that capacity will increase, and that those technologies, I think, are the nightmare scenario of security planners, because they have a number of different ramifications, a number of different implications in different parts of the world. So you might be avoiding a drought here and sustaining crop yields here while depressing them elsewhere, right? And I think that any unilateral deployment of those technologies that is not mediated by strong multilateral governance institutions is prone to unleash distrust and countermeasures and all sorts of miscalculations and misunderstandings on the negatively affected countries, of course, right? And in an era of increased geopolitical competition and great power competition, I think this is a recipe for all sorts of problems, right? So also, you know, these ways to address climate change without addressing the root cases of climate change, which is the energy system and fossil fuels and so on, might have other security-related effects and need for strong governance institutions. And finally, my final governance-related point here goes the other way around and looks at the ways in which security concerns, which are now increasingly high in the agenda and shaping other parts of the agenda, might have an impact on climate governance, on climate international climate politics, right? And it has been mentioned that it might hinder climate negotiations and climate cooperation. I have to say that the Biden administration seems to be trying to insulate climate politics from great power competition, and I think that Kerry has been rather open about this, and the EU seems to be in that same line. And I think that the US-China agreement in Glasgow points in that this bilateral agreement they reached in the middle of the Conference of the Parties points in that same direction. But anyway, it is always possibly a problem, but more to the point, my biggest concern here is that the industrial requirements for the energy transition right now depend on very long supply chains that look ever more fragile and more vulnerable, right? The very stuff of the next industrial revolution depends on probably the security-wise the most fragile spot in the world, which is the island of Taiwan, right? Which of course tells us about the zeitgeist that we are leaving behind, in which everything seems possible and you know and the market seem to be able to resolve all kinds of problems and provide us with safely with the kind of drivers that we need for technological change, blah blah. It now looks a bit more risky to not have, you know, not have placed the development of certain technologies in certain places, or not have created redundancies and resiliencies here and there so as to you know, address the next industrial revolution in a way that is less dependent on the whip hand of a hand in the Taiwan Strait. But more broadly, I think that thinking about the electrification of transportation in a context in which Germany and China and hence Volkswagen and the Chinese market and investment are not getting along that well. I think it is a bit more complicated than we had thought it would be, and so I that would be my last concern. It's all about concerns. My 4 points. I have used Michael Clare's and Monsiabad's comments as, in a way, Christmas trees to hang them over without much of a consistency. But I think that these were things that had been left unsaid, and that perhaps might be my contribution without overlapping with the people who have preceded me in the use of the floor. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Oriol. I'm afraid we all talk about concerns here. You know, the room for optimism is quite small at this point. And thank you also for for enlarging our view on dependencies, different dependencies, and also on governance, global governance, which is at the end a possible way out. Let me now go back to some of the points you've raised during the conversation, and I just want to remind everyone watching that the chat is open, and I invite you to start making questions and asking questions. But Michael, I wanted to ask you whether you could tell us a little bit more. You've talked about this division, about what is climate as a threat and at the national and international levels. And you mentioned in the national level that it has to be a priority for the military to adapt. And you've also mentioned, which I don't think many people are aware of, the risk, for instance, for the Navy in different places about raising sea levels and so on. You know, we pay attention to the impact on people's livelihoods, on vulnerable villages and so on, but not so much about the military. And my question to you would be, how can the military adapt? I mean, by definition, the armies are large institutions, quite rigid and difficult to transform. So how can, at this point, the military adapt to climate change?
Well, the US military in particular, but I think also other NATO countries, from what I understand, have been giving a lot of thought to this question and see ways in which they can adapt, but they also see a responsibility to mitigate the impacts of climate change. So the US military, and I think those in NATO countries, are also seeking to reduce their own emissions of greenhouse gases. So the US military is by itself one of the leading emitters of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, because it's a major user of fossil fuels and always has been. So there is pressure for the military to convert from fossil fuels to renewable forms of energy itself, to mitigate its own contributions. And the various services, military services, are attempting to do that, for example, by converting their non-military fleet of vehicles. They have hundreds of thousands of trucks and all kinds of vehicles to hybrid and all electric vehicles. They're also converting the bases. Where do they get energy for their own bases, installations, to power whatever their electrical needs are, to move from reliance on fossil fuels from the grid to being self-sufficient through solar power and wind power. And there's a lot of that work going on. And I could talk about that, but to get the idea. The other problem, though, is their own vulnerabilities. And the greatest vulnerability is to naval ports that are, by definition, at sea level, and especially those on the east coast of the US that are exposed to the Atlantic Ocean, the rising ocean, and extreme storms. So they are being forced to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild facilities that have been destroyed in storms and to move them to higher elevations and to otherwise harden facilities against storms. And so this gives you an idea of what I mean.
Thank you very much. Now I wanted to go over the topic that has been mentioned several times, the role of China, both China and Russia, the needed role of China and Russia in this global conversation, and the risk that the current situation can really affect the global coordination in climate change and environmental issues. And I wanted to ask Montse how you see that. Oriol has also mentioned the role of global governance in that regard, the role of Special Envoy Kerry, how he's trying to keep that conversation going on despite all the situation. But on the other hand, there is a tendency, we are seeing a growing tendency to isolate Russia in every international affair, given how Russia is behaving in the international arena, how it is completely despising the international law and the global order. So how can we face that? Montse, how do you see we can stick to the need to having Russia and China being an essential part of that conversation, especially China being the second polluter in the world? It is completely necessary, but also Russia, of course.
Wow. Well, yes. Security diplomacy and climate diplomacy, it is more than negotiations. It must be more than negotiations, and should be taking place also in the corridors and beyond in many possible actions. The sad thing is that just before the invasion of Ukraine, things were vibrant in this sphere, were lying at the intersection of security, environment, and peace and climate, because the linkages between environment, security, peace, and conflicts have already been recognized at the highest political level since 2007 in different forums, which are very relevant, because just in the United Nations framework, in the Security Council, there have been many different meetings using the formula area, but also in different events. If I am not wrong, there were at least 8 debates in the very recent debates on climate security, and also in the United Nations General Assembly, in the United Nations Peace Building Commission, also in UNEA, the Environmental Assembly. So there was a sort of emergent agenda on security and environment before this critical date of the 24th of February. In fact, there were many experts, NGOs, even institutional representatives, in particular from UNEP, from the United Nations Environmental Programme, claiming, asking for the recognition, the formal recognition of that agenda. And the necessity to mainstreaming it into the core of the United Nations in order to spread it all over the institutional framework to other international organizations, and not only NATO, but also the European Union, OSCE, and many relevant international NGOs. And even the United Nations Secretary General, in the recent report launched last September, our common agenda, considered the climate change among one of the cross-cutting issues regarding peace. So everything was well prepared to formalize this agenda. In addition to all of that, the International Law Commission is working at the moment on a draft project for some years on the protection of environment in relation to armed conflict. There have been proposals to define a new crime of ecocide. So, well, there are different moves in diverse directions, but all of them have in common that they lie at the intersection of this rich area where many things are happening. But in December of 2021, there was a project of resolution to be adopted at the Security Council on climate change and peace, and this was vetoed. The states who voted against were Russia and India. The case of India is not a veto, of course not, as you all know, but well, this was like a prediction that something was moving. Well, not a prediction as such, because we do not have a global pact on the environment, because things were moving in a different way regarding the possible adoption of a global treaty for the protection of the environment, because it's a great paradox that we have a long list of principles regulating the coexistence between states, as for instance, the prohibition of the use of force, the non-intervention, etc. But we do not have yet a principle just saying something so simple as is necessary to protect Mother Earth. There have been many tries since 2017, and they had 5 votes against, and these votes were, well, the USA, but with the previous administration, with the Trump administration, nothing to do with the current one, of course, Russia, Syria, Eritrea, North Korea. And so what are the prospects now? If I had to give a 30 seconds answer to your question, it would be very difficult for me. I'm not optimistic. I suppose that setting Russia aside, because it's not easy to do collaborative things with Russia at the moment, the key player to take into account, to be attracted, is China, because it's relevant for everything, not only for climate, but also for biodiversity, also for the pollution, for plastics, the new plastics treaty, also for the Antarctica and for the Arctic as well, where it is a new player which is entering this thing. So we have to find new innovative ways to break the silos and to build bridges between these things which are isolated, these boxes which are isolated, and to attract China, to attract India, and big players like this is very important. And if there is no consensus, at least, because consensus is key in environment, as in many other sectors of international law, to move forward, at least a huge majority, in a way that Russia and other countries are falling apart with a stigma in that sense.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting that you mentioned isolation on the one hand and also the vetoes at the Security Council. And I just want to, if you allow me, I want to recommend an article that we published at S Global not long ago about how North Korea is one of the countries most affected by climate change, because it is putting a huge risk on food security for them, because it is impacting a lot on their food production in a country which is already isolated by itself, and how North Korea seems the regime seems to be willing to cooperate with others, to approach other countries in that sense, so they could also fight with their own system. While it is true that on the other hand, North Korea is launching new missiles and testing new missiles, which is not very comforting. Anyway, Oriol, I wanted to tackle another issue, which is well, one of the supposed trends that the conflict with Russia is accelerating is the deglobalization. It is not a new issue. We've seen that, of course, the pandemic was a sudden stop in the globalization process, but this was new. It came from before, and now we are seeing an acceleration. On the other hand, you've mentioned this very interesting transfer of dependencies from petrostates to electrostates, and not only electro, but all the countries producing the materials, the minerals that we need to have renewable energy. And the fight for resources have always been in the origin of many conflicts. So my question, to make it simple, do you foresee potential conflicts, potential bellic conflicts with some of the countries that are now producing these raw materials, these minerals, that we all need to be able to move beyond the energy transition and the green transition?
I'm not going to break the rule of not making predictions, not even under torture. So the only thing I might say is that if we do move in that direction of a serious energy transition that shifts wealth and power towards those having the right kind of minerals that we will need for that transition, this will have an impact on the form of those states, the form of those regimes, and the relationship they have with their neighbors and their own societies. And this is, I think, well understood in the literature and with rentist states and so on. And I think that then everything depends on local conditions, right? Some of them are pretty stable and some of them are not. And then, of course, all these changes will hit the ground in different places under different conditions. So I'm really not going to make a prediction here. But let me say something on governance. I think that I would like to introduce a bit of a nuance on the need for cooperation on climate change. Right now, the architecture of climate multilateralism has changed quite a lot since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, and it is a much more decentralized regime than it used to be. It's not based on a global deal in which states agree on multilaterally negotiated, legally binding targets and timetables, right? They all adopt their own nationally determined contributions, and these NDCs are then updated once every 5 years, or if you have Glasgow, then perhaps which requested states to update it before the next COP, and the cycle can turn a bit faster. It's basically based on the fact that states are subjected, and this is legally binding. States are forced to have a debate on their own climate objectives every now and then, and they have those debates under conditions that they are of not their own making, right? But other conditions that are shaped by reports by the IPCC and demonstrations organized by Scandinavian teens, right? Or just to I'm putting it in these terms because there's a lot of contingency here, right? And it all depends on things that might go one way or another. They will have these debates on other conditions that have to do with initiatives of the UN SecGen, for instance, right? With these climate ambition summits in which you only get to talk if you are going to make a new proposal in terms of your own NDCs. So it's a much more decentralized process in which states do not need to agree on everything with everybody before taking the next step. What we are seeing is a process in which states are now showing themselves to be, some of them, willing to go it alone, willing to take steps before others take steps. China pledged decarbonization for 2060 before even the US has had its own presidential elections, right? The pledge was in September 2020. I think that the process is a bit different. I think it is not super clear to me that we should think of this as basically a problem of cooperation in the provision of a public good. The literature is not going that direction. We might have been, when thinking about climate negotiations under those lenses, as an article put it, we might have been prisoners of the wrong dilemma. What I think is that there are other effects that a more security-centered environment will have on the governance of climate politics. The first one is that, of course, all those factors that shape national debates on NDCs depend on saliency. And of course, the less we pay attention to climate change and the more we pay attention to other apparently more urgent matters, even if climate change is super urgent, of course, the less salience it has, the less traction that process will have in pushing NDCs forward towards closing the ambition gap towards that 1.5/2 Celsius degrees. And then the other issue here is that I think that there might be, we might be facing a backlash in energy costs, a popular backlash against high energy costs, which of course are crucial if we need to move forward in energy transition. We need to make sure that energy internalizes the full costs of climate change, particularly, of course, energy coming from fossil fuels, and it might scare the world out of policymakers who might be losing any political will to move ahead with the kind of taxation or carbon pricing that would ensure or make a energy transition easier. The yellow vests were already a first flashpoint in that regard, and for instance, they shaped very much the debate in the European Parliament, for instance, and with the trialogue with the European Parliament and the Council and the Commission on whether there should be any the expansion of the emission trading scheme towards private transportation. That debate is now being framed under the shadow of the yellow vests, and I think that, of course, the shadow of citizen mobilization against high energy costs will also play a role here. So my point here is not so much that we need to be able to agree with Russia and China to move forward, which we of course do on many different things. But I think that that's not the key point. Moving forward right now seems to be a much more state-centric process, and the regime seems to be a multi-speed regime right now, not the kind of agreement, a global agreement that moves only at the path of the slowest member. But there are perhaps a bit more tricky processes, mechanisms by which stronger competition for power and, of course, violent conflict will hinder climate governance.
So thank you very much for all your interesting remarks. Now let me give the floor to Joanna Artemi, one of our of the persons in the audience. Joanna, please.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, first of all, I thank you all speakers. It's been a really fruitful discussion. Actually, my question has been addressed by both Montse and Uriel, so it's going to be for Mr. Michael Clare. And it's about climate change in the political agenda. We have seen so far that politics have not come ahead of time. It's kind of, we see politics as a reactive, would say, structure that, like, for instance, there's global warming and then we argue on climate principles and climate agenda, such as the 2030 agenda or Paris Agreement. And we have seen so far that climate change and global warming has been yes, it has been at the core of the political agenda, but the political focus has shifted from climate change to the war in Ukraine, as Montse mentioned. So here my question is, how do we do to place climate change permanently in the core of the international political agenda in order to better or enhance our response to it?
Yes, indeed, the question of the moment. And it's not easy for me to provide an answer to that because right at this very moment, the Biden administration, which a year ago had come in with a very strong climate change agenda as part of its priority for governing. And that's been pushed aside in the past few months because of the war in Ukraine. And there is no atmosphere in Congress whatsoever to address that issue, climate change, right now. Everything is going to be, how do we punish Vladimir Putin and Russia more severely? And I think it's going to be a while before that wave of that intensity of feeling dissipates, and the Biden administration can return to a climate change agenda. So we have to be aware of that, and I don't know when that's going to occur. What I do think is that the war in Ukraine is like a giant explosion that has set off shockwaves around the world. And those shockwaves have yet to we haven't seen the end of those shockwaves, and they're going to continue, and we don't know what they are going to look like. And I do think that they will bring us back to climate change in the end, because I do think that one of the most profound shockwaves from the war in Ukraine is a global food crisis that is just now gaining momentum. And this food crisis is intertwining with climate change around the world. And so we will have to address the food crisis. I think there will also be a migratory crisis, not just in Europe, but around the world as a consequence of this, that will be intertwined with climate change. So I think in time, we may be able to step back and see how the war in Ukraine, but war in general, increasingly is intertwined with the security impacts of climate change. And then maybe we will be able to bring it back into the political agenda. But I think it will require that kind of understanding of the intersection of traditional security issues, war and peace, with these global issues to accomplish that.
Thank you very much, Montse. Oriol, do you want to add anything to this question? Okay, if not,
I agree completely with Michael's words. I would only add that the work in one sphere must and can benefit others. And here we have huge challenges. We could be faced with measures which should be and could be beneficial for solving the problems posed in different fronts, in energetic transition, the food crisis, the peace, everything in the framework of an environmental peace building as a conceptual framework. Maybe this is, well, I am at the risk of oversimplifying, but it's just for giving a sort of short sentence to transmit the main message in this regard.
If I may, if just in one word, I think the answer to the question, how do we place climate change at the top of the agenda permanently, is organized. I think that's the key. I mean, you are part of the society, you are citizens, which means that you are a political agent. Use that agency.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Joanna, for your question, and thank you all for your answers. I have other two questions here. They are not addressed to anyone in particular, so please feel free to answer whoever you want. One is, how feasible is to see the status of climate refugee legally recognized in the near future? And would it be, if it could be helpful to at least mitigate some problems? That would be the first question. The second one is about the Arctic meltdown. If you have any views on the security implications of that event, since there are some relevant actors interested in that region, such as China, Russia. You've mentioned some of them during the conversation too. So who wants to go first?
Well,
Oriol, maybe we can start with you, or Michael, go ahead, please.
No, let Montserrat go first, and I could talk about the Arctic.
Well, so I would speak about the lacks or the drawbacks in the Geneva Convention on Refugees. And it is true that it doesn't cover the urgent situation of the climate refugees, because, as all you know, it requires a key aspect, which is the persecution. Well, the climate refugees are not persecuted as such because of their race, ethnicity, or political ideas. And this is a very important drawback and a very unfair situation in practice. Because they are not economic migrants as such. They have to leave their countries because of reasons that they are not purely economic. And well, how feasible, how likely is the question? I don't know. I know that at least there is an awareness, a general awareness about that in the level of states, the policymakers, but also in the level of the European Union and the United Nations. And there have been moves in the last years, even in the national planes of different countries in the South America, in the Asia as well, in particular in countries which are especially affected by the effects of global warming or the sea level rise, or particular consequences of the climate change. And so there have been internal laws which have been adopted, recognizing some rights and facilities for climate refugees. And some experts are starting to consider that there could be an emergent customary law for recognizing a future status of climate refugees who should be covered, should enjoy the status of refugees as such, as foreseen in the Geneva Convention. So it is still a long-term issue, because, as you know, the customary law, the international customary law, is very slow, generating new norms, and there can be an impasse for years. So it is too early to say if it is when it is going to reach that legal new status of a new customary norm. I don't think that we will see a treaty, at least a multilateral treaty of a big scope in this regard, because we all know how things are with respect to migration in all these years. And even the European Union had a directive for temporary protection adopted in 2000, and it had to wait 22 years, almost 22 years for implementing it, for applicating it in the practice when the Ukrainian refugees are coming. So in this case, it's not because of a disaster, a weather disaster, but because of a war. We know, but I mean that the migration issues have been stuck, even in organizations as European Union with executive competences in this regard. So I'm not very optimistic, but at least we can see the bottle half full, because there are moves forward in different sub-regional contexts.
Thank you very much. Michael, please.
Yes, I appreciate the question about the Arctic, because this is a topic of great interest to me. So first of all, the Arctic is warming faster than anywhere else on the planet. And as a consequence, the Arctic ice cap is melting very rapidly. And this is one of the ways in which climate change can be scientifically demonstrated, because you can have satellite photographs of summer sea ice going back decades, and you could see how each summer the extent of summer sea ice is shrinking. So for skeptics, this is one of the clearest demonstrations of climate change in effect. And this shrinkage of the ice cap has very significant security implications. I'll mention two of them, or three of them. One of them is it has made possible the exploitation of the vital resources of the Arctic region. The Arctic is believed to have something like 30% of the world's remaining untapped natural gas. And this is going to be essential to the extent that we continue to rely on natural gas. And a lot of this is in Russian areas, but some of it is in the territories claimed by other Arctic nations. And there are territorial disputes that remain unresolved in the Arctic. So we have to worry in the future about these territorial disputes, just like we see in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, other areas where there are resource disputes. These are occurring in the Arctic. The other way in which the Arctic has become a security problem is because it's become part of the chessboard of global great power competition. Because now you can deploy navies there and use the Arctic as a war zone in a way that wasn't possible before. Russia relies to a great extent on the Arctic for its naval forces, because its main year-round naval base is at Murmansk, above the Arctic Circle in the Kola Peninsula. And as competition between Russia and NATO has increased, so have tensions in that area. And NATO, with the US, has been building up its capabilities for conflict in the far north of Norway, in Iceland, in surrounding waters. And there are very elaborate war games underway constantly, just recently now in Norway, above the Arctic Circle, and Russia does the same. So in the event of in the event that a conflict over Ukraine escalates into a NATO-Russia war, the Arctic region could very well become part of a future battlefield in Europe. So, and this is because of climate change. It's the first time, I think, that climate change has altered the global strategic chessboard, and it's a fascinating development that deserves more attention.
Uriel, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just one little thing on refugees and climate change, which is that I think that we should be aware of the fact that how do we define climate refugee will be of the essence here. Climate change, again, has a number of different, it interacts with a number of different social processes. And sometimes it just makes pre-existing conditions or pre-existing problems just a little bit more difficult, perhaps crossing a threshold. And I think it's going to be very difficult to distinguish climate refugees from non-climate refugees in a number of different situations. Who has been pushed away from their homes by climate change or by any of the problems that underlie this very strongly multi-causal chain of events that brings them to be forced to leave their towns and cities. I think it's going to be a bit of a complication. And if we define it very broadly, then we bring climate refugees to economic migration scale, an economic migration scale process, which makes states a bit wary of accepting that kind of definition. And if we bring it down to very narrow definition, by which climate refugees are those who are only climate refugees, and in which climate change expresses itself in its most perhaps picturesque and easy and clear and nuanced ways, then that will benefit just a small number of people. So my issue here is that climate change will be part of our lives, and it will be part of our societies, and it's going to be very difficult to distinguish what social processes and to what extent social processes depend on climate change or not.
Thank you very much. We've almost reached the end of our session. I want to thank you all. It's been really interesting. Thank you for sharing these insights and your knowledge about the matter. I'm sure we remain with a lot of questions, so that is good because we all need to keep learning. Of course, I also want to thank all the audience for being there. And I just want to invite you all to participate in our next debate, which will be in April 20th, and it will be about cybersecurity, another very interesting subject related to defense and NATO and security. So, of course, I also want to remind you to participate in the competition. You have all the basis, all the information in Esglobal, in the website. And of course, I want to thank again the universities which collaborate with us in this project. I don't want to forget thanking Virginia, our interpreter, who's always doing a great job behind the scenes. And of course, the Embassy of the US in Spain, which is our partner in this project. Thank you very much, and looking forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.